Hello and welcome to Women of the Middle East podcast. This podcast relates the realities of Arab women and their rich and diverse experiences. It aims to present the multiplicity of their voices and wishes to break overdue cultural stereotypes about women of the Middle East. Season 5 is a collaboration between Musawah and Women of the Middle East podcast. As we will be discussing Musawah's latest book, Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage, Towards Egalitarian Ethics and Laws, published by One World Academic in December of 2022. My name is Amal Malki. I'm a feminist, scholar, and an educator.
This is Women of the Middle East podcast.
Hello, and welcome to Season 5 of Women of the Middle East podcast. This season is dedicated to the groundbreaking book, Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage. In this episode, we go through Section 2 of the book, Lessons from the Prophet. This section is made up of 3 chapters. The authors of these interrelated chapters tap into the prophetic teachings, proposing a new paradigm for looking at contemporary spousal relationships based on justice and equality in Muslim families. In addition to reading these teachings in relation to the context we are living in, informing our contemporary realities. The first chapter in this section forwards Prophet Muhammad and Khadija's marriage as the ideal archetype of Muslim marriages. The second chapter supports it with hadith reports, and the third section applies Quranic ethics to interpret these hadiths. I'm delighted to be chatting today with the authors of the first chapter, Reclaiming Khadija and Muhammad's Marriage as an Islamic Paradigm towards a new history of the Muslim present. Today we have with us Dr. Sara Ababneh and Dr. Shadaab Rahemtulla. Lovely to have you both.
Thank you.
I would like to begin by asking both of you about your role and contribution to this complex yet important project.
Okay, I can start. So I think what really spoke to us about Khadija radiallahu anha's and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's marriage was that it spoke to our own realities. We relate to each other as equals. We met each other while doing our PhDs. Sarah is about 4 years older than me, so she was finishing her PhD when I started mine. And she always wanted to move to Jordan. And so I moved to Jordan for love, and I moved there for 9 years. So this for us was a historical relationship that we could relate to. And that's really what got the ball rolling and enticed us to learn more about that history.
Sarah, what do you think? What was the most that attracted you to this project, besides what Shadaab, of course, said?
I mean, I think the problem is that in a lot of Muslim societies, and is that there we have this kind of very traditional, we call it Islamic model, where you know, men are told they can't get married until they are able to provide. There's this idea that you should marry somebody who's older than you, the woman, and there's this kind of very hierarchical setting. And then, actually, if you think about it in terms of Islam, we see that that is not a reality at all. We also have taboo against kind of people remarrying. People, you know, we have a taboo against divorce. And when we look at the early Islamic period, we see that most of the Sahaba were married constantly. I mean, they all married each other. We don't know this. So when we think about these taboos, in fact, they're actually very Western taboos. And they actually have very, very little to do with our Sunnah and our Islamic heritage. We really wanted to question that perception, because especially in societies that claim to be Islamic, when these perceptions actually have very few roots in Islamic history.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And this is exactly what you do in your chapter. Now, your focus on hadith is a shift in methodology, right? From previous studies of Islamic feminists, where many have avoided engaging with hadith and instead grounded their argument on the Quran itself. How and when did this shift take place in your opinion?
So you're absolutely right. Early Muslim feminists have basically said, look, we have a reality, and in this reality we have so-called laws that we think are based on Islam. And actually, when you look at them, they are the laws of man, and I'm saying man as in men, right? Mostly fuqaha. And these fuqaha, when they have spoken, when they've written, have not necessarily gone back to the Quran or to the Hadith. That has been one of the main kind of critiques from Muslim feminists, is to say, actually, why should we trust the work of certain men at a certain time? We can go back to the Quran, and the Quran is just. And so a lot of work has been done around that. There have been critiques of certain Hadith because they were written down 200 years later under circumstances. And there has been a lot of, again, critique of the way that these hadith have been written down, at the way that certain hadith were actually in direct contradiction to the Quran. But I think that, as Muslims, we still respect that hadith. And there's actually quite a bit in there that is very helpful. And when it does not contradict the Quran, I think that we should look at them. But the important thing is that when those hadith, and this is something we say in the chapter, that under Jordanian personal status law, which is supposedly quote unquote based on Sharia, Prophet Muhammad and Khadija radiallahu anha, if they had lived today, if Khadija's guardian had said, I don't want them to marry because they are not compatible financially, he could have avoided their marriage. So what does that say about that understanding that we have of Sharia, when even according to the Sunnah that everyone agrees on, it contradicts it. So I think that the spirit of what the Muslim feminists have done, which is basically say, wait, what are we saying is Islam? Who has actually said this? And let us go back to the most important text, which is of course the Quran and the divine source. But then we can also look at other sources, and when they don't contradict the Quran, I think we should absolutely look at them.
And just to add on to that, to clarify, what we're doing is looking at the seerah, right? We're looking at prophetic biography and not hadith per se. So Sayyidina Abdul Qadir is looking at hadith. So we're looking at prophetic narratives from Ibn Ishaq, but also Ibn Sa'ad and the Tabaqat literature. We're looking at Ibn Kathir, Abu Ja'far al-Tabari. And so we're looking at that literature. And the idea is not to shift away from the Quran and focus on post-Quranic texts, extra-Quranic texts, but rather to build on what the first generation of feminists did in their rereading of the Quran in the light of gender justice, and to explore other textual traditions, in this case the seerah, in other cases hadith, Islamic law, but also usul al-fiqh, the mystical tradition. And the idea is to really understand that if we want to change realities on the ground, we have to engage all of these traditions within a Quranic framework, because these traditions hold legitimacy amongst Muslim communities on the ground.
You use the example of Khadija and Prophet's relationship to deconstruct the dominant narrative and histories of Islamic marriage, and reconstruct one that is based on justice, love, and equality, and specifically focusing on two snapshots from their marriage. Can you tell us more about those two examples?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is in this history, we have these two snapshots. First of the marriage, and second of Khadija's presence during the first Quranic revelations. And I think that's a real challenge, because you have to reconstruct a history based on just two snapshots. And yet even those two snapshots tell us so much about a profoundly non-hegemonic relationship. And so just to give you a taste, the teaser of the first snapshot, what we have is a woman who is very successful. Ibn Sa'ad, in his biographical dictionary of early Muslim women, says that Khadija's caravan was the equivalent of the entire caravan of the Quraysh. We have someone who brought 3 children into her marriage with Muhammad, who was in 2 previous marriages. One marriage, the husband died, another marriage, they were divorced. And she was the one who proposed to the Prophet. The Prophet was actually the passive partner in this. She approached him, and in biographical literature from Al-Tabari and Ibn Ishaq, we actually have the wording of her proposal. So what we are seeing is something very different from what we are exposed to today, in which the man is the active partner, the powerful player, and the woman is passively acted upon. So this is all to say that just from these 2 small snapshots, we see so much that points to very alternative configurations of a marital couple coming together.
And also what is interesting is that when you look at the sources, of the seerah sources, we see that the early sources actually have no problem with this. They don't have a problem with the fact that Khadija was married before. They don't have a problem with the fact that she had children. They don't have a problem with the fact that she was the one who proposed. it's today's sources that want to erase that. They want her to be a virgin. They want her to stop working. So there's, Razwi, a contemporary scholar, kind of has this whole kind of spiel about how she kind of, after they got married, she stopped and she put her whole energy and her creative energy into the household and making it nice. So it's a very kind of bourgeois understanding of, the father who works and the mother who stays at home, and of course it's none of that is in the early sources. So what we see is actually the problem is with today's modern sensibilities. It is our modernity that is so conservative that for us this is like kind of, oh my God, what? She proposed to him? What? She was still working. She's the one who actually supported. And of course, again, this is deeply connected to how our personal status laws, our family laws have been conceptualized. The whole concept of the family laws that is based on law and qawam, so obedience and maintenance, is based on the fact women live in the husband's house and that the husbands provide, and therefore women have to obey. I mean, the second snapshot is about early revelation. So how the Prophet received the Quran and how he felt at that time. And he was actually extremely, and we know this, again, as children, we learn this in first grade. We learn how he was scared. He ran to Khadija. He said, Zammilini, Zammilini, cover me up, cover me up. And we know all that. We know she was the first Muslimah. Right? We know that. But we don't think about it. We don't think about how actually it was marriage to such a strong person who enabled the Prophet to realize he was a prophet. And it was within that marriage that was able to blossom and to develop. We also don't know as much that actually it was extremely, it wasn't just at the beginning that he was there. It was a long period where he was extremely worried about losing his mind, about being crazy, that he actually contemplated his own life. And again, the early sources speak about that. Of course, for us to say that, it almost felt like we were religious saying something. But so there was also vulnerability in the Prophet. And I think this is important too. And again, it's important from our current, I want to say, capitalist structure, where all of us, men and women, have to be the perfect, almost God, not even human, because we cannot make mistakes. We have to be perfect. We have to be perfect father, provider. We have to do so much that we actually can't. And actually, when we go back to the Quran and to the Sunnah, we see that the prophets were humans. They made mistakes. That is what humanity means. And that vulnerability is okay. It's okay to be vulnerable. But in modern masculinity terms, it's not okay to be vulnerable. And I think that's very important to learn that and to say saying no to this kind of forced perfection that breaks us, that nobody expects from us as humans. And actually being vulnerable, of course, to God, but also being vulnerable in marriage, and that marriage allows for this vulnerability and allows for two people to support each other, not in their perfection, not because they're maintaining each other and they're, providing whatever, a sexual favors. Actually, that it is something that is it is a vulnerable relationship, and it allows for us to be human, and it strengthens us. It allows us to be stronger, but it's okay to be vulnerable in it.
And the sources are very clear that the Prophet was profoundly vulnerable. Like in the biography of Al-Tabari, the Prophet contemplates throwing himself over the crags, over the mountain, because he doesn't want to be called a madman by his beloved tribe. So, of course, we can't verify if he was suicidal or not, but we know two things. Number one, there are narratives of it in authoritative biographical sources. And number two, the historians don't have a problem with it. They don't feel the need to compensate and say, no, but the Prophet was a real man. They don't feel the need to say that. They're comfortable with that. And Khadija, when he went up to her and said, Zammilini, Zammilini, she was there to catch him when he fell. She went up to Waraqa ibn Nawfal, her Christian cousin, who knew the scriptures very well, to verify his prophecy. She had the famous narrative of sit on my lap to verify is this an angel or is this a jinn, right? And what's very important is a lot of folks critique Khadija by saying, yeah, but Khadija represents the pre-Islamic period and Aisha represents the Islamic period. And our response to that is this: their life was a 25-year relationship, but Allah gave us two snapshots: a snapshot of their marriage and a snapshot of the Quranic revelation, first Quranic revelation. I think that there's great wisdom, great hikmah in that of the two snapshots, one of them fundamentally connects Khadija to the Quranic revelation. And I think that really should shape then how we understand revelation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's beautiful. Khadija and Muhammad's relationship not only challenges the notion of a male provider and dependent wife, but offers an alternative model for a marital relationship built on mutual care, support, and love, as you said. But Dr. Shadaab, your work counteracts and invalidates an established discourse on marriage based on men's superiority and females' inferiority. This says volumes about historical facts and framings, right? And you here reclaim a sidelined or maybe intentionally excluded past that would have had a different power dynamic relation between men and women within, the family construct. Are we able to rewrite history?
That's a great question. So I'll sort of give you a response and then let Dr. Sara jump in. So one of the methods that we're using is called a history of the present. And this comes from very important philosopher Michel Foucault. And he basically argues a history of the present is a way of critiquing the present by way of exploring alternative paths. So the idea is that history writing in and of itself is a political project. We are presented with a certain narrative of history that legitimates the status quo today. And so history can be something very subversive and empowering and liberating, because when we look through the sources, we can see very different pasts that in turn will not only challenge the present status quo, but show us different ways of reconfiguring that status quo in a way that is more inclusive, different voices and experiences. And that's what we're trying to do with this history. This is a history of the present because it's a history that allows us to not only critique the present, but to change that present as well.
And this is important. It's important to also recognize history is political. What we remember, how we remember it is political. So when we say, oh, look at the Romans, they were always patriarchal. The father could kill anyone in his household. This is right. As the father of a family, to kill the slaves, to kill the children, to kill that was his right. And so, of course, what does that mean when we remember this history and we don't remember histories that were matriarchal or egalitarian? What it does is it says that when we have a patriarchal present, that is natural, that is normal. It's always patriarchal and it will stay patriarchal. At the core of remembering history is a political act. And to recognize that, say, even we think it's political. What the status quo is political, and we're doing political too. But to kind of say that from the get-go, yes, we are looking at histories that were silenced, and we're looking at those and saying, once we kind of bring them into the picture, how does our understanding of today change? What does that mean for today? If all of a sudden we have all these other histories that we never knew about, how can we be different today in our present? And so that's kind of the methodology that we use, and it's extremely important in order to fight current injustice, to kind of say, well, let's recognize the politics in these methods that are seen apolitical.
Definitely. But what needs to be done to mainstream this paradigm and replace the old one that has been a part of not only the legal systems in our part of the world, but also the popular memory of Muslims around the world? What do you think we could do?
I mean, I think one thing is this story is not it's not like this hidden little story. Every child grows up learning about Khadija. We as Muslims, we love her, we know her. The problem is that has not then changed into a paradigm, into a norm, into something that we can look at. So I think in one way it's actually not that hard. I keep emphasizing this, understanding that this is hegemonic. What I mean with hegemonic is it is what everyone believes in, but the roots are actually Western modernity and conservative modernity. So it is about the bourgeois family and the story of provider, and which, by the way, even in Western societies was never the case. It's just an image that was given. The majority of women globally have always worked. The majority of workers have always been women. So this idea of a woman who's been taken care of is actually the experience of a minority of women across history.
So just to add on to that, it's very important for us to make these arguments for gender equality and egalitarian relationships from within an Islamic framework. And when we do that by excavating Islamic history, we legitimate what we're saying. We can't be written off as, oh, this is just a UN project or a Western secular project. No, when we make a statement about divorce not being a taboo, and we say, actually, if you look at not only Khadija, but if you look at almost all of the Prophet's wives, with the exception of Aisha, they all had prior relationships in prior marriages. And many of them, Salama, Habiba, came into those relationships to the Prophet, peace be upon him, with children. Aisha once boasted that she was the only wife of the Prophet who was a virgin. So it means she was the exception. She wasn't the norm. And when we challenge these types of taboos, I mean, Khadija throughout her life, her kunya was Hind, the first child that she had with her first husband. And Hind remained as her kunya through her 25-year marriage to the Prophet. When we make these arguments challenging taboo of divorced women from that type of Muslim history, who can challenge you, right? Anyone who takes that religion seriously can't really challenge you.
And especially that now, of course, a lot of injustice is being done against women who are either divorced or widows, who, if they want to remarry, they will have to give up their children. Their children cannot be with them in a new household. So you as a woman are being told, either you stay unmarried or you lose your children. And that's a terrible situation to put women. And this is the predicament of thousands of women across the Muslim world. There is no taboo in Islam around divorce.
Dr. Sara, you've researched actually Muslim family laws. And as you know, in the MENA region, the legal system and personal status laws in specific continue to be major obstacles towards women's rights. What are examples? I know you've mentioned a couple of examples now, but what are other examples in which current family laws or practices contradict the model of marriage proposed by Khadija and Muhammad, despite, claims that those legal models are inspired by the Quran?
So I think the most important one is this whole idea that I already mentioned of qawameh. So the idea that men are providers, have to be providers, and that and therefore women there has to be ta'a, which means that men can say you're not allowed to work, you're not allowed to leave the house, etc. So this is the most important thing because it's actually at the core. It's at the core of Muslim family law, and that's extremely problematic because it immediately creates a hierarchical relationship that is based on provision. So this is, I think, the most important thing that we need to remember, that this whole idea of being a provider, and because you're a provider, you are in charge. And it's not in the Quran either. It's not, that because you provide, it means you can control. But it's also not in the Sunnah, of course. And I think that's the most important thing because it's the root of the inequality within marriage.
Definitely. I think al-Qawama and the guardianship, al-Wilaya, are the two basic components all marriages in Islam have been built upon. And this type of research really provides an alternative model, alternative narrative that, again, I go back and say we need to work on mainstreaming it. If we cannot replace the old one, let's offer this as an alternative. Now, this question is for both. You speak of how certain masculinities, understandings of what it means to be a man at a certain time and place are valued more than other types and forms, and how these masculinities themselves, as well as their evaluation, changes over time and context. Then you forward a new framework, which is feminist masculinity. I'm very, very interested in that. How do you conceptualize the concept of feminist masculinity?
So I think, first of all, the idea is to understand masculinity as something that is productive, right? Not something that is, oh, this is polemical, this is a problem, let's get rid of it. Masculinity is a reality. The question is, how can we reshape it so that it can actually not only exist within, but support an egalitarian relationship? We used a very straightforward definition, what it means to be a man in a particular time, in a particular place. And so accenting the context of the definition is important, because it means that masculinity is not one thing. It's shaped by a particular social setting, and therefore it can be reshaped for different social settings. And when we look at the type of masculinity that was not only cultivated but flourished in this 25-year monogamous marriage, I think we can see something that can be very inspirational and harmonious for 21st century Muslim marriages, in which both the husband and the wife are working, and in many cases the wife is the primary earner, and in many cases the sole earner of the family. If we look at the historical records, we don't see any examples of marital discord between Muhammad and Khadija in that time. On the contrary, after Khadija passed away, at the end of the Meccan boycott in Am Huzn, in the year of sorrow, the Prophet continuously praised Khadija for everything she had done for the community, to the extent that his later wives, it became a point of friction because he kept on talking about her in such glowing ways, right? So what we can see, what we can glean from the sources, is someone who was very comfortable in that marriage. And I think that's very important, because he did not feel threatened. He did not feel insecure because of the economic strength of his wife, the social capital of his wife. On the contrary, he saw it as a win-win, a win for her and a win for him. So it wasn't me versus you, it was something much more reciprocal. It was us, it was a couple, it was a community. And if we can take that seriously as a part of the Sunnah, I think that's going to shape and help a lot of marital issues in which a man can no longer be a man. With the cost of living in today's society, hegemonic masculinity is a fiction. No man can live up to that and just hand out the money in that. It doesn't work that way. So in many ways, feminist masculinity, a masculinity that supports egalitarian relationships, is more in touch with the real realities on the ground, in which both have to provide in order for the household to actually survive.
But I think this, and again, this goes back to our current value system, where basically we are saying, and of course, as Muslims, we are guilty of this. We as Muslims imagine our Prophet to be a rich man. So we have a very classist understanding of Islam. So we are told in school, we fast in Ramadan to feel with the poor. So what? So Muslims are rich, and so the rich are Muslims, and so all the millions of poor Muslims, who are they fasting for? To feel with themselves. So we have a very rich-centered point of view, and of course, current masculinity is like this. And we see it in Hollywood movies and Bollywood movies, all these movies where you are a man if you are rich, and we see how people treat workers, look down on them, but also in the family. And I think actually, if you look at the story, it's about provision to enable, and this is, of course, again, this is not a mainstream. This is a very extremely rich example. I mean, example of the wealth that Khadija radiallahu anha had is extreme, right? So, but she did not use that wealth to become she wasn't good because she was rich, and she didn't use that money to kind of put herself on top and say, I'm the boss, I decide, and you. No, it actually enabled marriage to be a good marriage. But then also that means that your value doesn't derive from that, and that you have to help. Because of course, we're not saying, men shouldn't be providers, women should be providers. No, nobody actually realistically can be. In current situations, both are working very hard, barely able to provide. But it's divorcing provision from value, and from saying you don't get value just because you're able to provide. And in the family together, you are able to create something is divorced from how much you create in terms of money.
And just to quickly add on to that, moving back to what Dr. Sara was saying about vulnerability, right? The Prophet was vulnerable, and the classical historians have no problem with that. There are various narratives that talk about the Prophet not being able to pay for the mahar, for the dowry, and that Gabriel comes down with jewels for the mahar, and none of the pre-modern scholars have a problem with that. Whereas I have read modern biographies of the Prophet by select Muslims who are uncomfortable with that. They cover that up, and they say things along the lines of, the Prophet paid X number of she-camels in the dowry, when none of the classical sources show that, right? So it's not just about material wealth, it's about vulnerability. Again, the marriage, the proposal, the Prophet was clearly a very shy person We imagine the Prophet as a caliph, but he wasn't a caliph. He was a very soft-spoken person, and I think the Prophet can be a window to understand the earlier Prophet and to reread the earlier Prophet in the light of that non-hegemonic masculinity. We know that Prophet Musa was very uncomfortable going up to Fir'aun because he had a lisp when he spoke. Right? That is not hegemonic by any standard. And that's why he asked Allah to open the knot in his tongue. Right? Again, when we situate this non-hegemonic masculinity within an Islamic framework, we not only critique hegemonic masculinity, but we legitimate other ways of being a man that is healthier in a broader community.
Absolutely beautiful. Now, the other two chapters in this section of the book build on yours. Can you outline the threads of connection and your reflection on how these threads solidify the argument of the alternative paradigm you're forwarding?
I mean, I think if we start with Abdul Qadir's chapter in the sense that absolutely. I mean, what can we do? What is important to people, and how can they use? And this is something every Muslim can do. Every one of us can go to the Quran, and through the Quran, reading the Quran as a direct relationship to God, we can, we're Allah, we have the tools, and so it is an extremely important tool, and actually, despite the way that we've read, the very patriarchal way which we have imposed in our readings, there is still a lot of gender egalitarian messaging in those sources that are, that we can use. And I think with Amin's chapter, how do we do that then? I think that the three chapters work together and saying, this is one example, but ethics is very important. Like where this ethics is there, it's in the Quran, we believe in it, but we have normalized, and this is of course injustice. The way it works is that you normalize it by othering people. You believe that everyone is equal, but yet you have no problem speaking down to your housekeeper at home. These ethics are extremely important. Bringing these ethics back and saying, no, you cannot justify injustice, keeping that there and doing that. And a lot of people do this through the Quran, but also using the rich sources that we have through the Sirah and the Hadith.
The Quran is fundamental. It is Kalam Allah, is understood as the word of Allah, and so it does have to be prioritized. But the text also has a lot of silences, and it is very broad in its discourse. Can you paint a painting with the Quran? I don't know. I think you can have the foundations of a painting. I think you can have the foundational ethical sketch that you need. But to participate in the process of painting, you need something more granular and detailed. And I think the specificity of Sirah narratives, the Hadith, the legal angles of fiqh, I think this allows us to collectively come together and to really paint something that can be different, that can speak to our reality and can still be true to the Quran and to Allah, right? So I think that the Hadith offers us something very, very specific. And again, it allows us to speak to what really matters to a lot of Muslims on the ground. As much as Muslims love the Quran, the Hadith, the fiqh, all part of it. So I think it has to be engaged if we change realities on the ground. Just to add one more point, it's important not to essentialize the literature. That one camp is saying, oh, it is patriarchal and that's the way, and we're saying, no, it is feminist and that's the way. What we have in the Hadith literature is a collection of contesting, even contradictory voices. So the question we're asking, why is one strand, one voice elevated to the level of paradigm, and we don't even know about the other? So it's really a battle over memory, our past as Muslims, as a community. And the idea is to say, look, if another strand speaks to our realities in a better way, let's elevate that strand so that we can be true to the message of the Quran, to the original sketch, right? So it allows us to paint a picture that contests another painting that excludes so many painters.
We all need to collectively promote such an alternative model, one that is indeed based on the Prophet's, peace be upon him, life, that shows him in the right light, that promotes justice, equality, love, dignity. As Dr. Sara said, this is something that we all learned really early on in our lives, this marriage, this very unique marriage, but it's not still yet, it's not part of how we perceive marriages in Islam, unfortunately, as if it's the exception rather than the norm. So how do we make that the norm? We need to revisit, I think, our educational curricula, but also we need to mainstream it through media, through culture. And again, you leave me with many ideas. Is there anything else you want to say to conclude this discussion?
I just want to add that, and this goes back to how you began the interview. You asked us about the first generation feminist scholars in Islam who are focusing on the Quran. And we're branching out into the Sunnah in general and the Seerah, the prophetic biography literature in particular. But we're also doing something that's very similar to what the first generation was doing. First generation was not just focusing on the Quran. They were saying that tafsir has been dominated by men. And as a result of that, men's experiences have been foregrounded at the expense of women's experiences, challenges, and issues. And we're saying the exact same thing, that women need to take their rightful place in interpreting not only the Quran, but the Sunnah in general, and the prophetic biography in particular. And as long as men continue to dominate the interpretation of Seerah, the interpretation of the law, the interpretation of School of Fiqh, the interpretation of the mystical tradition, we will not have egalitarian paradigms and models that we can try to emulate and live up to. And so a big part of this is saying we need to have women take their rightful place in intellectual circles, in mosque spaces, so that they not only participate, but that they lead discussions and lead critical reflection and meaning making about the history of our faith. And that is what a history of the present is about. Because when women do that, the present will not only be deconstructed, but we can reconstruct it together as feminist women and feminist men to produce a more just reality in the Muslim community.
And here it's very important to also kind of see women not as see differences between women. And the work of Dr. Mohammed Madood comes to mind here when she says, how do you read the story of Hajar, who as Arabs we believe is our mother, as single mother who's abandoned by her husband in the middle of the desert, and how does that kind of go to kind of single mothers today, and how do you read that? And so having these different voices, and people not just saying, oh, we also need women, we also need women who are not rich women, educated women. How are their experiences? How is them reading? What do they think is important? And that is what it means to say Islam is for all times and spaces and people. It means that we can all, it speaks to us, but we can also speak at our experience in our diversity, allows us to capture something that's very important, to be able to hear that.
Thank you.
This is Women of the Middle East podcast.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of Season 5. To stay up to date with Women of the Middle East podcast, you can subscribe and don't forget to rate us. If you would like to contact me directly, you can do so on Instagram or Twitter or via email.
This is Women of the Middle East podcast.